consumption, then the solution is very clear. You don't have to cut back. What you have to do is you need people to buy more. You need to, in fact, stimulate desire in people. You need to get people to buy more things. And that is exactly that. I mean, early advertisers realize this, early industrialists realize this. In the historical work that's been done, I mean, they talk explicitly about what they need to do and what advertising should be doing. For example, let's go to quote number 2. This is from an advertising expert called Emily Fogg Mead. This actually is the mother of the most famous anthropologist there was, Margaret Mead. This is her mother, who was an advertising person, who in 1901 said that, quote, this is quote 2, "We are not concerned with the ability to pay, but with the ability to want and choose, which means opening up imagination and emotion to desire." We don't really care if people can afford this or not. That's not. We don't. What we need to do is we need to open up imagination and emotion to desire. In fact, one of the people who wrote a history of department stores actually called his book "Land of Desire." Land of Desire. Another advertiser said, quote number 3, about this: "Without imagination, no wants. Without wants, no demand to have them supplied." Which is a very, very succinct. Unless there is demand, then there is no reason for the supply. So you've got to, and you notice the way it's, the wording actually is very interesting. The wording isn't "let's tell people more about products." It's about imagination. It's about emotion. It's about desire. That's the way, it's the way advertisers started to think from a relatively early time. So not right at the start, but we'll see how quickly they came about. Let's go to quote number 4. Okay, so in terms of, if you wanted to go back to the defense and the criticism, of this, there really isn't a lot of support for the defenders saying that the reason you have the immense accumulation, the immense collection of commodities is because people needed it. That's not the way. The reason you have more and more products is because that is what industry needed, and then it required industry to try and stimulate desire in the population, in consumers, to try and match the supply they had. This is Benjamin Barber, who wrote a book just came out recently called Consumed, looking at this period, and he says, quote 4, "Here was the critical transition from capitalism as a production-based system, where saving was a leading virtue, to capitalism as a consumption-based system, where spending would become the leading virtue." Stop there for a second, right? The critical transition from a production-based system, where saving was a leading virtue, to capitalism as a consumption-based system. As a consumption-based system, where spending would become the leading virtue. The transition from a necessity-driven and static rural life to a mobile and urban discretionary culture of, and he's quoting someone else now, of the automobile and the airplane, motion pictures and radio, the electric light and appliances, bottled soft drinks and canned soups. That's the new society that was needed. He says, quote, and this is his summing up, he says, "A transition, in other words, from a system that serviced wants to a system that produced wants." There's one thing to say, okay, here are the wants that exist and we're now going to service them, to producing the wants that you're going to service. Okay, this is what Galbraith would call the revised sequence. Now remember, actually, some of the marketing people actually would actually acknowledge this. Remember, some of them actually said, actually, in the early years, there was too much of a focus on trying to sell what had been produced, on trying to create demand, trying to create desires. But that, remember, the marketing people said that changes sometime in the 20th century. So actually, I don't think there is on this point. I don't actually think there is a lot of debate between critics and defenders, because we're talking historically. Actually, we have people who've studied this historically. Now, to make that possible. So what you have to do is you have to stimulate desire. Well, I'll put it in more practical terms. If you're a manufacturer of shoes, for example, you've got to expand your market. If your market is largely upper class people, you've got to expand your market downwards, so it's middle class people and working class people as well. And at the same time, so that's one way. Within the area that you live, can you expand your market vertically, from top to bottom, or whichever way you want to go on that? At the same time, why limit yourself to, if your factory is in Boston, why limit yourself to Boston? Can you expand your market also nationally? Can you expand your market so you're not just selling to people in Boston, you're selling to, in Chicago and Washington and and Los Angeles perhaps a little bit later on? Can you expand your market? And that's called horizontal expansion. That's just what you have to do. Now, at this point, that may be what you want, but that is impossible to do. That is impossible to do unless there is, in fact, a communication and transportation system that makes possible getting your goods, getting what you produce, to somewhere else. And again, the second part of the development of these broad changes is changes in communication and transportation. Again, that's the major hauling, getting commodities from one place to another is a major factor of how you expand markets. You have to have those mechanisms, and in fact, the major development of this, of course, is the development of the railway, which makes possible relatively cheap transportation of goods across the country. So now, in fact, manufacturers can think about expanding their market, the immense accumulation of commodities, in fact, by also trying to find markets elsewhere as well. That's the second development. And thirdly, there is a development of urbanization. That is, there are incredible movements of population at this time. As America is transitioning from a rural agricultural society to an urban industrial society, there are two twin movements of migration. First of all, from the European countryside into American cities. That's one movement. And of course, the movement from the American countryside into American cities. And so this is at the turn of the century, the 19th century to 20th century. I mean, the scale of migration is immense. The scale of how many people are actually, and what they're doing is they're actually going from one style of living, one way of living. It's not a style. It's a way of living that is on the land, working farms, etc., making things for yourself. They're going from that to a situation in which they are going to work in factories producing things for someone else, for which they will get wages in return. It's a very, very, very different way of thinking about how to live. The movements of population are also, in fact, movements, or they're also indicative of huge transformations in how people are living. For example, in 1860, we're still in the 19th century, in 1860 about 80% of the population is rural, as I mentioned. By 1900, which is 40 years later, only 50% of the population is rural. Now, within historical terms, that's a blink of an eye. 40 years is a blink of an eye to have those kinds of transitions taking place. And of course, that figure of how many people are involved in agricultural pursuits goes down and down and down and down. To today, where it is virtually zero. Because even the people who are working on the land, working it not for themselves. There are some farmers who still work for themselves, but the vast amount of even agricultural work is you work for someone else. You're producing food in a what's called agribusiness, in an industrial setting, industrial mode for someone else. So you're getting wages rather than producing it for yourself. Again, that's the movement from rural to urban. From rural to industrialization is one of these key movements. Urbanization then, and what this does is you now have, of course, if that's the case, you now have, instead of people making goods themselves, growing their own food, making their own clothes, etc. Instead of that, you're now in a situation where people are working for long hours in a factory. And when we're talking long, we're not talking 8 hours. We're talking actually 12 hours and even more. I mean, the early factory, early experiences of the factory are very, very difficult. They're very, very hard for the new workers who are coming in. So you work for 12, 14 hours, you get wages for that. You don't have time now to be able to, you don't have time or what's called the means of production to grow your own food or to make your own clothes, or you don't have the time and you don't have the resources. So you now become a new market. You become a market for products. So new markets are created. Let me give you one example. Let's take a very staple commodity. Let's take something like bread, which was a staple of the diet during this time. In 1850, at the start of this transition, only 10% of bread is baked commercially. That is, of all the bread that is consumed, only 10% of it is bought in the marketplace. That is, you go somewhere and you buy a loaf of bread that someone else has produced. Well, by 1900, that figure is up to 25%. And by 1930, that figure is up to 60%. Now, those figures actually tell us a way in which, I mean, if you can generalize them, they tell us the ways in which the market has become more and more important. In 1860, relatively unimportant. By 1930, by 1900, much more important. That is, people they're now going to the market as consumers, using the wages that they get from working in industry to buy the products, to buy what they need, in fact, to survive. Now this creates new products, new markets for goods. So all these change. I mean, those are the three that you got industrialization, you got developments in communication and transportation, and you got developments in urbanization that are revolutionizing what American society looks like. Okay, these are broad changes. They don't happen overnight. As I say, we're talking about 50 years, 60 years in which these are happening. But as I said, 50, 60 years in historical terms is a blink of an eye when we're talking about these kinds of changes. Let's go to quote number 5, where I've given you some. You can see then that there is actually, there is some relationship between expenditures on advertising. That is the middle figure. You see, in 1880, there's $200 million spent on advertising. By 1916, that is up to like 1.4 billion. And on the next column over is GNP, gross national product. That's an indication of how much is being produced in the society and how much economic activity there is. And you can see as that goes up from 13.1 billion in 1890 to 49, advertising goes along with it. Now, the question are they causal? Are those figures causal? That is advertising leads to greater GNP, or in fact, does greater GNP lead to more advertising? That I'm not arguing right now, even though some of the evidence we've looked at indicates that in fact advertising plays a key role in stimulating demand, which is key then to producing more things. But at the very least, what this tells us is that there is a correlation, that advertising and the growth of industrial society is linked in some way. Now, hopefully what I've just said is not actually anything new to you. I hope that's basic social and economic history that you should have done at least in high school, and in terms of understanding what's happening understanding what's happening in transformations in the culture. The next thing I want to look at is business strategy, and this actually is not often looked at. I mean, what I've given you so far is a standard kind of view that you'd find in most marketing textbooks. And what I want to stress, what I want to now look at is, how do we go from that situation where goods are, remember in the pre-situation, which is goods are unbranded, right? They do not have trademarks. They are just, it's just flour, it's just crackers, it's just lumber, it's whatever. How do we go from that to a situation